The courtroom was buzzing with the low hum of conversations, people shuffling papers and the occasional creak of worn wooden benches. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching dust in the air and creating a warm golden haze across the polished floor. The atmosphere carried a mix of tension and routine, as if the room itself had learned to expect the drama and surprises that unfolded within its walls. Today, however, there was an unusual ripple of curiosity. Among the usual faces of lawyers, defendants, and spectators, one figure stood out, a young teenager who looked far too inexperienced to be taking on a legal case. The teenager walked steadily toward the center of the courtroom, his shoes tapping lightly against the floor. He carried himself with a calm confidence that contradicted his age. Most of the spectators barely gave him a second glance, dismissing him as another observer or a family member of someone involved. But the judge, a man who had spent decades presiding over countless cases, immediately noticed him. His eyes narrowed slightly, the corners of his mouth tugging into a faint smirk. There was something amusing about the idea of a teenager standing at the podium, supposedly representing a case. "Is this some kind of joke?" the judge muttered under his breath, audible enough for a few people in the front row to hear. A ripple of suppressed laughter passed through the gallery. The teenager's calm eyes met the judge's, unflinching as though he understood the unspoken doubt. He didn't stumble or fidget. He simply adjusted his papers and prepared to speak. The case was minor in legal terms, a dispute over a local business matter, nothing violent or criminal, but in this moment, it became a test of character, patience, and perception. The opposing counsel, a seasoned attorney with years of courtroom experience, raised an eyebrow at the teenager. "Are you representing yourself or—" She trailed off, clearly searching for a word that would explain this situation. "I am representing my client," the teenager replied clearly and politely. His voice was steady, confident, carrying just enough authority to demand attention. It was unusual, even startling, how composed he appeared. There was no tremor, no hesitation, just clear, articulate words. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the bench. "Well, this should be interesting. Let's see if you can make more sense than you look." The remark was tinged with amusement and skepticism. The courtroom chuckled lightly again, some people glancing at the teenager with curiosity, others with doubt. The teenager, unfazed, began his opening statement. He spoke with clarity, outlining the facts of the case in simple, precise terms. He pointed to evidence, cited precedents, and addressed the courtroom with a quiet authority that seemed beyond his years. Each sentence was carefully constructed, each argument logical and compelling. For a moment, the laughter and whispers in the room faded, replaced by an attentive silence. People leaned forward, drawn in by the surprising depth and insight of someone they had assumed would be inexperienced. As he spoke, the judge's initial amusement began to shift. The smirk faded, replaced by a curious frown. He had seen many young lawyers in training, many students trying to find their voice, but this was different. The teenager spoke with an ease and knowledge that suggested he had spent years studying, practicing, and understanding the law, even if his youthful appearance suggested otherwise. The opposing counsel tried to interject, asking questions and challenging points, but the teenager responded calmly and accurately, never losing his composure. Each answer was precise, each rebuttal thoughtful. The courtroom began to murmur again, but this time it was not ridicule. It was intrigue. People exchanged glances, whispering quietly about the surprising skill of someone so young. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others simply sat in quiet admiration. A small detail caught the judge's attention. The teenager's notes were meticulously organized, highlighted in different colors with charts and references neatly aligned. It was clear that hours, perhaps even days, had gone into preparation. This was not a casual endeavor or a whim. It was serious, deliberate, and highly competent work. For the first time, the judge leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the bench. He watched the teenager closely, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. Who was this young person? And how could he command such respect and attention in a place where so many adults struggled to maintain even basic decorum? As the opening statements concluded, the teenager stepped back, giving a small nod to the judge and opposing counsel. The courtroom was quiet, the previous chatter replaced by a sense of anticipation. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain the usual authority and control over the proceedings. Well, that was unexpected. he said, choosing his words carefully. "We will see if your arguments hold up under closer examination." There was no mockery in his voice this time, only a cautious acknowledgement that the teenager might be more capable than anyone had assumed. The teenager smiled faintly, a small gesture that carried confidence without arrogance. He had prepared for this moment, anticipated skepticism, and remained composed throughout the initial encounter. Yet he also knew that the real test had just begun. The opening statement had set the stage, but the courtroom drama, the cross-examinations, and the final judgment would reveal the full measure of his abilities. Outside the courtroom, word of the teenager's presence had begun to spread. People stopped in the hallway, curious about the young person taking on a case usually reserved for trained attorneys. Some doubted his abilities, some were impressed, and some simply wanted to watch and see what would happen next. The small buzz of conversation added to the tension inside the courtroom, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that this young person might have more to offer than anyone expected. Inside, the teenager took a deep breath and adjusted his papers. He had faced doubt, skepticism, and mockery in the short time he had been in the courtroom, yet he remained focused. His eyes scanned the room briefly, noting the expressions of the judge, the opposing counsel, and the spectators. Each glance, each reaction, was part of the larger picture, a puzzle he had to navigate with skill and precision. The judge finally called the first witness, signaling the next phase of the proceedings. The teenager stepped forward, ready to question, ready to challenge, and ready to prove that his age was irrelevant in the face of preparation, intelligence, and determination. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing that something unusual and memorable was unfolding. Every movement, every word, every glance carried significance. The teenager understood that he was not just representing a client. He was representing the idea that talent, skill, and intellect could not be measured by age or appearance. He felt the weight of responsibility, the quiet pressure of expectation, and the subtle thrill of being underestimated. As the witness took the stand, the teenager opened his notebook, flipping to the carefully prepared notes. The questions he would ask, the objections he might face, and the strategy he would employ were all planned meticulously. Yet he remained flexible, ready to adapt, ready to respond to the unexpected. It was a delicate balance between confidence and humility, knowledge and curiosity. The judge watched silently, leaning slightly forward, his initial amusement replaced by cautious respect. He had faced many young lawyers before, but never one like this. Calm, composed, and remarkably skilled. The courtroom felt charged with anticipation, as if everyone present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, even if they could not yet fully comprehend it. The teenager began questioning the witness, his voice steady and clear. Each question was purposeful, designed to uncover facts and clarify points for the benefit of the case. The witness responded, sometimes hesitantly, sometimes confidently, but the teenager guided the conversation with a deft touch, never aggressive, never condescending. He listened carefully, adjusted his approach when needed, and maintained a professional demeanor that seemed unusual for someone his age. Across the room, the opposing counsel watched with a mixture of surprise and concern. The teenager's skill was undeniable, and each question seemed to strengthen his position. The courtroom atmosphere shifted once again, from skepticism to cautious admiration. People whispered quietly, noting the unexpected competence, and the judge nodded subtly, recognizing the growing credibility of the young attorney. Time seemed to stretch, each moment filled with concentration and subtle tension. The teenager's ability to navigate the proceedings with poise and intelligence was remarkable. Every decision, every question, every glance was deliberate and effective. The courtroom, once filled with doubt and amusement, now paid close attention, intrigued by the unfolding display of talent. As the session continued, it became clear that this teenager was more than a novelty. He was a serious participant, a capable advocate, and a presence that demanded recognition. The judge's initial mockery had faded completely, replaced by a growing respect for the young person standing before him. The spectators, too, began to see the teenager in a new light, understanding that appearances could be deceiving and that talent often emerges in unexpected forms. The day's proceedings moved toward a temporary pause, with the judge calling for a short recess. The teenager gathered his notes, carefully arranging them, his mind already analyzing the next steps. Outside, murmurs of curiosity and admiration grew louder, and the story of the teenager in court began to spread beyond the walls of the building. In those first hours, the courtroom had witnessed a transformation, not in the teenager, who had always been prepared and confident, but in the perception of those around him. The judge, the opposing counsel, the spectators, all had begun to reconsider their assumptions, realizing that skill, intelligence, and determination could not be measured by age or appearance. The teenager had not only represented a client, he had challenged perceptions and planted the seeds for a remarkable story that would continue to unfold in the hours to come. The courtroom was quiet after the brief recess, but the air was filled with a subtle tension. Everyone inside seemed to sense that the day was far from ordinary. The teenager returned to the center with a steady pace, his notes in hand and a calm expression that betrayed none of the nerves that most people would feel at such a moment. The judge gave him a measured look, no longer mocking but still carefully evaluating. The courtroom seemed to lean in, as if waiting for the next move, the next display of skill that would either prove or disprove the teenager's remarkable abilities. The first witness returned to the stand. This time the questions would be more detailed, more probing. The teenager adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat lightly before speaking. His voice carried an even tone, careful and precise, and each word seemed to cut through the quiet like a well-aimed arrow. The witness appeared nervous, glancing at the judge and then back at the young attorney, unsure of what to expect. The teenager asked clear, structured questions, each one designed to draw out key facts and expose any inconsistencies in the testimony. He listened attentively, making quick notes, and then followed up with more pointed questions that challenged the witness without aggression. The opposing counsel frowned slightly. It was obvious that the teenager's preparation was far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Each answer he drew from the witness strengthened his case, and the courtroom began to shift in its perception. People who had been skeptical were now leaning forward in their seats, eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Even the judge's expression had changed. There was still a trace of wariness, but it was now combined with genuine curiosity and respect. The teenager paused for a moment, considering his next line of questioning. He was aware of the subtle dynamics in the room, the unspoken judgments and the expectations that were being placed upon him. He had anticipated this challenge, but the reality of being scrutinized so closely was still intense. He took a deep breath and asked the next question, carefully phrased to reveal a crucial piece of information that had been overlooked. The witness hesitated, then answered truthfully, providing a key detail that shifted the balance of the argument. A small murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by the insight and strategy the teenager displayed. The opposing counsel exchanged a quick glance, realizing that this young person was not just competent but unusually perceptive. It was rare to see someone so young navigate the complexities of a courtroom with such skill and poise. The teenager continued, moving through his notes with precision. Each question, each observation, each challenge was carefully calculated. He had spent hours studying the case, anticipating the lines of argument and preparing counterpoints. But he also relied on his intuition, reading the room and adapting to the witness's reactions. It was a delicate balance between preparation and instinct, and he managed it flawlessly. As he spoke, small details that had seemed insignificant began to take on importance. He pointed out contradictions in the testimony, highlighted overlooked evidence, and connected facts in a way that was both logical and persuasive. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the tension palpable. Spectators leaned forward, lawyers shifted uneasily in their seats, and the judge listened intently, clearly reevaluating his earlier assumptions. During a brief pause, the teenager glanced around the room, taking note of the reactions. Some faces showed surprise, others admiration, and a few still carried doubt. He didn't let any of it distract him. His focus remained on the case, on the evidence, and on presenting the truth clearly and convincingly. Each moment was an opportunity to demonstrate skill, each interaction a chance to prove that appearances could be deceiving. The witness grew more cooperative as the questioning continued. Realizing that the teenager was thorough and fair, there was no intimidation, only careful, respectful inquiry that demanded honesty. It was clear that the teenager understood human nature as well as the law, and he used that understanding to guide the witness's testimony. The courtroom atmosphere shifted again, from skepticism to attentive engagement, as people watched a young person demonstrate a level of maturity and intelligence that few could match. At one point, the opposing counsel attempted to challenge the teenager's line of questioning. She spoke quickly, citing legal rules and precedent, but the teenager responded without hesitation. His answer was precise, accurate, and backed by research. He acknowledged her point politely, then explained why his approach was valid, presenting his reasoning clearly and logically. The judge nodded slightly, recognizing the depth of understanding that the teenager displayed. The exchange drew the attention of everyone in the room. People whispered quietly, noting the confidence and skill of someone so young. It became evident that this was not a casual experiment or a fluke. This teenager was prepared, capable, and highly competent. Even those who had doubted him began to reconsider their assumptions, realizing that age and appearance could not determine ability or expertise. As the questioning continued, the teenager introduced additional evidence. He laid out documents, photographs, and records with careful explanation, connecting each piece to the facts of the case. His presentation was clear, organized, and compelling. The judge listened closely, occasionally making notes while the opposing counsel struggled to keep pace. The courtroom had shifted. The teenager had captured the attention and respect of everyone present. Throughout the session, the teenager maintained his composure. He never raised his voice, never displayed frustration, and never appeared flustered. Each response was thoughtful, measured, and deliberate. It was a display of skill and discipline that was rare, especially in someone so young. The spectators began to murmur in admiration, whispering about the surprising competence of the teenager, who had once been dismissed as inexperienced. During a brief pause in the proceedings, the judge spoke quietly to the courtroom clerk. There was a subtle tone of respect in his voice that had been absent earlier. The clerk nodded, understanding that something unusual was happening. The teenager's performance had shifted the energy of the room, challenging assumptions and commanding attention. The judge returned his focus to the proceedings, ready to witness the next phase of the case. The teenager reviewed his notes, preparing for the next witness. Each line of questioning had been designed to reveal specific details, uncover hidden information, and strengthen his client's position. He anticipated potential objections and formulated responses in advance. His preparation was meticulous, his strategy clear, and his execution flawless. He understood that the courtroom was not just about legal rules, but about communication, perception, and persuasion. As the next witness took the stand, the teenager began his questioning with the same calm confidence. He guided the testimony with precision, carefully navigating complex details and drawing out important information. The courtroom watched intently, the earlier skepticism replaced by a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and respect. People were beginning to understand that this teenager was not just capable, he was exceptional. The opposing counsel attempted to disrupt the flow with objections and challenges, but the teenager responded smoothly. He cited legal precedents, clarified points, and maintained his composure. Each interaction reinforced his credibility, demonstrating that he was not intimidated, not rushed, and not unprepared. The courtroom atmosphere shifted again, this time toward acknowledgement of his skill and intelligence. As the session continued, the teenager's strategy became evident. He was not just asking questions, he was building a narrative, guiding the courtroom toward understanding and subtly influencing perception. Each step was deliberate, each action intentional. The judge observed closely, occasionally jotting notes while the spectators followed the unfolding story with growing interest. Even the opposing counsel recognized that they were facing an unusual challenge, one that required more attention and care than they had initially expected. By the end of the day, the courtroom had witnessed a remarkable display of skill, preparation, and intelligence. The teenager had handled complex questioning, introduced critical evidence, and navigated objections with grace and precision. His performance had shifted perceptions, challenged assumptions, and commanded respect from everyone present. The judge, once skeptical, now regarded him with cautious admiration, recognizing that this young person was far more capable than appearances suggested. As the session adjourned for the day, the teenager gathered his notes and prepared to leave. People whispered quietly in the hallways, sharing impressions and expressing surprise. The story of the young attorney in the courtroom began to spread, capturing the attention of those who valued talent, skill, and determination. The teenager walked with quiet confidence, knowing that the real test was not yet over, but certain that he had taken another step toward proving that age and appearance were irrelevant in the face of preparation, intelligence, and courage. The morning sun streamed into the courtroom, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. The spectators had already begun to arrive, whispering quietly among themselves about the young attorney who had taken the previous day by storm. Today was expected to be even more intense. Everyone seemed to sense that something extraordinary was about to unfold. The teenager, calm and composed as ever, entered the courtroom carrying his neatly organized notes. His expression was focused yet serene, a reflection of the preparation and confidence that had brought him this far. The judge, seated firmly behind the bench, greeted him with a subtle nod. Gone was the earlier amusement. Now there was genuine attention and curiosity in the judge's eyes. The courtroom felt charged with expectation. Every person seemed aware that they were witnessing a rare event, one that challenged their assumptions and defied their expectations. The teenager began by addressing the court with a brief, respectful statement, acknowledging the proceedings and outlining the importance of clarity and truth in the testimony that was about to be presented. His voice carried authority, calm and measured, drawing the attention of everyone present. It was clear that he understood not just the legal procedures but also the subtle dynamics of communication and persuasion. The first witness for the day was an expert, someone whose testimony could significantly influence the outcome of the case. The teenager approached the witness stand with a mix of respect and determination. He began by asking basic questions, ensuring that the witness felt comfortable and understood the context. Each question was precise and intentional, designed to guide the testimony toward relevant points without appearing confrontational. The witness responded, initially with caution, but gradually with more detail. The teenager listened intently, nodding occasionally, making notes in a meticulous manner. He seemed to absorb every word, every nuance, every hesitation. Then, with careful timing, he asked follow-up questions that revealed subtle inconsistencies and clarified crucial details. The courtroom began to notice the teenager's strategy. He was not rushing, not pressing aggressively, but skillfully guiding the witness to reveal the truth. The opposing counsel attempted to interject, citing legal rules and questioning the relevance of certain inquiries. The teenager responded with calm authority, referencing precedents, explaining the connection between his questions and the facts of the case. Each response was measured and well-founded, demonstrating a level of expertise that few could have expected from someone of his age. The judge observed closely, occasionally making notes, clearly intrigued by the unfolding skill and strategy. As the testimony continued, the teenager introduced documents and exhibits that supported his arguments. He presented each piece carefully, explaining its relevance in simple, clear terms. The courtroom could follow his reasoning easily, despite the complexity of the legal details. People leaned forward, some whispering in quiet admiration, others simply absorbing the unexpected competence of the young attorney. During a brief pause, the teenager reviewed his notes. He had anticipated several possible objections and prepared responses for each. His strategy was not just about questioning, it was about constructing a narrative that would make sense to the judge, the jury, and everyone present. It was a careful balance between law, logic, and human understanding, and he navigated it with remarkable precision. The next phase involved cross-examination. The opposing counsel attempted to regain control, challenging the teenager's points and questioning his approach. However, the teenager responded smoothly, countering arguments with evidence, precedent, and clear reasoning. Each rebuttal was respectful yet firm, showcasing his preparation and his understanding of both the law and human behavior. The courtroom was silent, captivated by the unexpected display of skill. At one point, the teenager introduced a line of reasoning that caught everyone by surprise. He connected seemingly unrelated facts, highlighted overlooked details, and built a compelling case that was difficult to refute. The judge leaned forward, clearly impressed, while the opposing counsel exchanged a worried glance. Even the spectators, some of whom had arrived skeptical or indifferent, were now fully engaged, realizing that they were witnessing a rare combination of intellect, strategy, and composure. The teenager paused, allowing the weight of his argument to settle. He made eye contact with the judge, subtly inviting consideration of the points he had made. The judge nodded slightly, acknowledging the strength and clarity of the argument. It was a quiet moment, but it carried significant weight, signaling a shift in perception within the courtroom. The day continued with additional witnesses and further examination of evidence. Each interaction was carefully handled by the teenager, who maintained a calm demeanor, clear reasoning, and an intuitive understanding of the courtroom dynamics. He guided the narrative without seeming forceful, allowing the facts to speak while ensuring that the audience understood their importance. The courtroom energy had shifted completely. There was no longer skepticism, only respect and attention. During a brief recess, people discussed quietly in the hallways. The story of the teenager's skill spread quickly, and word began to circulate that he was more than just a young advocate. He was extraordinarily talented. Some speculated about his background, while others admired his poise and intelligence. The teenager, meanwhile, remained focused, knowing that the day's critical moments were still ahead. When the proceedings resumed, the teenager faced a particularly challenging witness, someone known for evasive answers and complicated testimony. He approached with a clear strategy, asking questions that were both precise and flexible, prepared to adapt based on the responses he received. The witness attempted to deflect and confuse, but the teenager remained calm, redirecting the conversation with subtle guidance and thoughtful follow-ups. It was a masterclass in patience and strategy, balancing firmness with respect. The opposing counsel tried to object, but the teenager anticipated the move and had prepared a response. He addressed the objection clearly, citing the relevance of his questions and maintaining the court's attention. The judge listened closely, clearly noting the teenager's preparation and understanding of procedure. Each interaction reinforced the credibility and competence of the young attorney. As the questioning progressed, the teenager uncovered a key piece of information that had previously been overlooked. He highlighted its significance, connected it to other evidence, and presented a clear explanation of its impact on the case. The courtroom reacted subtly. There was a collective recognition that this teenager was not just competent, but strategically brilliant. The judge's eyes widened slightly, betraying his admiration, while the opposing counsel grew increasingly concerned. Throughout the session, the teenager maintained his composure. He never raised his voice, never rushed, and never appeared frustrated. Each movement, each word, each glance was purposeful. The courtroom audience followed his lead, drawn in by the combination of intelligence, calm, and clarity. People began to realize that this was not a typical legal proceeding. It was a demonstration of skill, preparation, and insight that few had anticipated. By the afternoon, the courtroom was deeply engaged. Every person present recognized that the teenager was handling the proceedings with a level of expertise that defied expectations. The witnesses responded more clearly and truthfully. The judge paid close attention to every detail, and the opposing counsel struggled to counter the carefully constructed arguments. The young attorney's strategy was unfolding flawlessly, guiding the narrative, clarifying facts, and subtly influencing perceptions. As the session drew to a close for the day, the teenager prepared his closing questions for the witnesses, ensuring that all critical points had been addressed. He reviewed his notes carefully, anticipating the next day's challenges, and maintained a calm, composed demeanor. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the energy charged by the unexpected display of talent and preparation. The judge, now fully attentive and respectful, made a few quiet notes and nodded toward the young attorney. It was a subtle acknowledgement of skill, intelligence, and composure that had completely transformed the judge's perception. The spectators whispered quietly, sharing their impressions and marveling at the teenager's capability. When the courtroom finally adjourned, people filed out with a sense of awe. The story of the young attorney's performance spread quickly, with witnesses, spectators, and staff discussing the remarkable combination of confidence, strategy, and intellect. The teenager walked calmly through the courtroom, aware that he had made a significant impression. His journey was far from over, but the events of the day had established him as a figure of respect and attention. The perception of what was possible for someone of his age had been irrevocably changed, setting the stage for the revelation that would soon shock everyone present. The next morning, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Word had spread across town about the young person who had outsmarted seasoned attorneys and impressed a strict judge. Even people with no connection to the case showed up early just to find a seat. The courtroom buzzed with whispers and curiosity. Some thought it was exaggerated talk. Others believed every word, but everyone wanted to see for themselves. The teenager walked in quietly, wearing the same calm expression as always. His clothes were simple, his notes neatly organized, and his confidence steady. He didn't seem overwhelmed by the attention or the weight of expectation that filled the room. The judge entered shortly after, tapping his gavel lightly to bring order. He looked at the teenager for a long moment before speaking. "I trust you're ready to continue," he said, his tone now respectful instead of doubtful. The teenager nodded. The change in the judge's attitude did not go unnoticed. People whispered softly, wondering what could possibly happen next to surprise them even more. The session began with the continuation of the witness examinations. The teenager took his place, reviewed his notes, and began to question the next witness. His tone was steady, polite, but each question carried weight. The witness, an older man with years of experience in the business at the heart of the dispute, seemed uneasy. It was clear that he had expected an easier time, but the young attorney's questions cut straight to the truth. The teenager's voice stayed calm and firm, and his eyes didn't waver. Every word seemed to have been planned in advance. The opposing counsel tried to interfere, raising objections, but each time, the teenager countered with precision. He cited rules, explained logic, and referenced evidence without fumbling. It wasn't arrogance, it was preparation. He never sounded rehearsed or mechanical, only confident and thoughtful. The judge allowed the questions, nodding along as if testing the teenager's reasoning and finding it sound. As the questioning continued, the tension in the courtroom thickened. The witness hesitated several times, realizing that the teenager's questions were leading him into uncomfortable territory. The young attorney kept pressing gently but firmly, connecting the man's testimony to earlier statements that didn't align. Slowly, cracks began to show. The spectators leaned forward, feeling the shift. The teenager was uncovering something deeper, something the opposing side clearly hadn't expected him to find. When the witness finally contradicted his earlier testimony, the teenager didn't react with triumph or arrogance. He simply paused, let the silence hang, and then calmly placed 2 documents on the desk. "I believe this record shows the correct sequence of events," he said softly, turning to the judge. The judge took the papers, examined them, and raised his eyebrows. The opposing counsel immediately tried to object, but the judge silenced her with a simple gesture. The courtroom was still. The tension had changed into awe. The teenager had not only caught the witness in a lie, but had done so with grace and intelligence. He didn't gloat or raise his voice. He simply stood there, composed, as if the moment spoke for itself. The judge finally looked up, his tone quiet but firm. "This changes things," he said, glancing at the opposing counsel. "Please continue," the teenager resumed, asking a few more questions that confirmed the inconsistencies. The witness's confidence crumbled. It was clear that his earlier testimony was unreliable. The courtroom erupted in whispers again. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. The teenager who had once been mocked for his youth was now the one unraveling the truth with skill and precision. After the witness stepped down, the opposing counsel asked for a recess, clearly needing time to regroup. The judge granted it, but his expression suggested that his patience for the opposing side's tactics was wearing thin. As the courtroom emptied briefly, people surrounded the teenager, congratulating him quietly or simply nodding in respect. He smiled modestly, thanked them, and returned to his seat. He didn't bask in the praise. His focus remained on the case. During the short break, the judge watched him from a distance. He could see that this young person carried himself differently. There was humility, but also deep understanding. It wasn't just about winning, it was about justice. The judge found himself wondering who had taught this teenager, who had shaped him into such a capable thinker at such a young age. When the session resumed, the atmosphere felt different. The opposing counsel had grown visibly uneasy, while the teenager's calm remained unshaken. The next witness was called, but by now the courtroom was already leaning in the teenager's favor. People no longer questioned his ability. They expected brilliance. The next witness tried to stay composed, but the teenager's line of questioning quickly revealed small gaps in his story. Each question built upon the previous one, creating a logical chain that led the witness into a corner. The opposing counsel tried again to object, but the judge overruled her. "He's following procedure correctly," the judge said, almost protectively. The crowd murmured in surprise. Even the judge was now defending the teenager's professionalism. As the testimony unfolded, the teenager presented a piece of evidence that caught everyone off guard, an overlooked document that tied the entire case together. It was a quiet but powerful moment. The judge examined it closely, and his expression changed. The evidence was solid and the reasoning airtight. The opposing counsel had no rebuttal. The judge glanced at the young attorney with a look that was part surprise, part admiration. "This is impressive work," he said simply. The teenager bowed his head slightly. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said. There was no arrogance in his voice, only sincerity. He returned to his seat and continued taking notes as if nothing unusual had happened. By now, the spectators were completely captivated. The case had turned from a simple dispute into a story of resilience, intelligence, and quiet strength. The teenager had faced mockery and skepticism, yet he had turned it all into motivation. Every action he took was precise, every argument clear. The courtroom had become a stage for his quiet brilliance. The afternoon session brought another unexpected twist. The judge asked the teenager a direct question about his background. It wasn't common practice, but the curiosity was too strong to ignore. The courtroom went silent. All eyes turned toward the young attorney. "I've studied law under the guidance of mentors for several years," he said calmly. "I wanted to understand how real cases work, not just read about them. This case gave me that chance." His tone was honest, humble, and clear. The judge leaned back, processing his words. "So you're not a regular intern?" the judge asked. "No, Your Honor," the teenager replied. "I've already completed my legal training, but I wanted to experience a real trial before applying for formal recognition." A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom. The realization began to spread. This teenager wasn't just a student pretending to know the law. He was a fully trained attorney, one who had been studying privately and was already far ahead of his years. The judge blinked in surprise, his earlier skepticism completely gone. "You've kept that to yourself all this time?" the judge asked. The teenager nodded. "I didn't want my age to be the focus," he said simply. "I wanted my work to speak for itself." The room fell silent again, but this time it was filled with respect. Even the opposing counsel looked at him differently now, her earlier irritation replaced by reluctant admiration. The judge cleared his throat. "Well, you've certainly made your work speak," he said. "I've seen many attorneys in my career, but very few handle themselves the way you do." It was an extraordinary statement, especially coming from a judge known for being hard to impress. The teenager smiled faintly, though he didn't allow the compliment to distract him. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said again, and then returned to his notes. The judge watched him for a moment longer before continuing the proceedings. For the rest of the afternoon, the courtroom felt different. The energy had shifted completely. Every word the teenager spoke carried weight. Every action drew attention. People knew now that they weren't just watching a brave student. They were watching a prodigy, a fully trained legal mind operating at a level beyond expectation. The case continued, but the focus was no longer on the dispute itself. It had become about the remarkable young attorney who had changed everyone's perception. The judge's earlier mockery now seemed like a distant memory. His tone toward the teenager was professional and warm, his respect clear. The opposing counsel, though still determined to win, treated the teenager with genuine seriousness now. As the day drew to a close, the judge called for adjournment. "We'll continue tomorrow," he said, glancing at the teenager. "You've presented your case well." There was something almost fatherly in his tone now. The teenager gathered his papers, gave a polite nod, and stepped back from the podium. The courtroom remained silent for a long moment before people began to speak in quiet, excited tones. Outside, reporters waited by the courthouse steps. They had heard about the case and wanted to see the teenager who had taken the courtroom by surprise. Cameras flashed, people asked questions, but the young attorney answered only briefly and politely. "I just did my job," he said. "It's about the truth, not me." His modesty only added to the growing admiration people felt for him. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold. The judge sat alone in his chambers, replaying the day's events in his mind. He remembered the first moment he had seen the teenager, the quiet figure he had mocked for looking too young to belong in a courtroom. Now he felt a mix of humility and pride. He had witnessed something rare, not just intelligence but integrity, patience, and grace. That night, the story spread quickly beyond the courthouse. People in cafes, offices, and homes talked about the teenager who had stunned an entire courtroom. Some saw him as an inspiration, others as proof that age doesn't define ability. The young attorney himself, sitting quietly at home, didn't think of it as fame or victory. He was simply glad that the truth was coming to light. The next day, the case would reach its final phase, and the world would see just how far preparation, determination, and humility could take someone who refused to be underestimated. The morning of the final hearing arrived with the same quiet anticipation that had filled the courtroom for days. People lined up outside before the doors even opened, hoping to catch one last glimpse of the teenager who had managed to turn a courtroom into a lesson in intelligence and humility. News reporters stood outside speaking into cameras, their words carried across the city. Inside, the air was still but charged like the calm before a storm. When the teenager entered, the entire room seemed to acknowledge his presence. He didn't walk with arrogance or pride. He moved with quiet focus. He placed his files neatly on the table, checked his notes, and gave a small nod to the judge as the proceedings began. The opposing counsel avoided eye contact at first, still shaken from the day before. The judge, once doubtful, now wore a faint, approving smile. The teenager began his closing arguments. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. He didn't shout or try to impress. Instead, he spoke from the heart, laying out every detail of the case like a story that needed to be understood. He reminded the court how truth had been buried under layers of manipulation and fear. Piece by piece, he reconstructed the timeline, showing how the lies had formed and how the evidence told a different story. He wasn't dramatic. He was honest. Every word felt like it carried a purpose. The audience listened without a sound. Even those who didn't understand law could follow what he was saying, because he explained it in plain human words. He spoke about responsibility, fairness, and how even small decisions could change lives. It wasn't just a legal argument. It was a reminder of why truth matters. The judge watched him carefully, his earlier skepticism replaced by deep respect. The teenager never stumbled, never lost focus. When he paused, the silence in the courtroom felt heavy, filled with the weight of his words. Justice, he said softly, is not about who has more experience or power. It's about who is willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. When he finished speaking, he stepped back, took a breath, and quietly returned to his seat. For a long time, no one moved. The judge sat back in his chair, visibly moved. Even the opposing counsel didn't rush to respond. She looked at the teenager, nodded slightly, and then began her own closing statement. She was composed, but everyone could see the difference. Her argument was technical, while his had touched something deeper. When both sides finished, the judge called for a short recess to review the case one last time. People began whispering as soon as he left the bench. Some praised the young attorney's courage. Others said they'd never seen anything like it. The courtroom had become more than a place of law. It had become a place of inspiration. During the break, a man from the audience approached the teenager quietly. He was one of the senior attorneys from another case, someone with decades of experience. "You've done something remarkable today," he said. The teenager smiled politely. "Thank you, sir. I just wanted the truth to be heard." The man shook his head with a small laugh. "You've done more than that. You've reminded everyone here why this profession matters." When the judge returned, the courtroom fell silent again. He placed his reading glasses on, looked at the documents in front of him, and then spoke slowly. "This has been one of the most extraordinary cases I have presided over," he began. "Not because of the complexity of the evidence, but because of the way it has been presented." He turned his gaze toward the teenager. "At first I misjudged you. I saw only your age and assumed you were inexperienced. I was wrong. What you've shown in this courtroom is professionalism, intelligence, and integrity." The teenager listened quietly, his expression calm but humble. The judge continued, summarizing the facts of the case. He outlined the points the young attorney had proven, the contradictions exposed, and the clarity he had brought to the entire proceeding. When he finally reached the verdict, The tension in the room was unbearable. "The court finds in favor of the defense," the judge declared firmly. "All charges are dismissed." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The young attorney's client turned toward him with tears in their eyes, overwhelmed with relief. The teenager simply smiled, shook their hand, and whispered, "It's over now. You're free." The judge wasn't finished. He stood from his seat, something rarely done in his courtroom. "Before we conclude," he said, "I want to acknowledge what we've witnessed here. It's not often that someone so young demonstrates this level of understanding, not just of the law, but of justice itself. You've reminded me of why this bench matters. I am honored to have presided over this case." Everyone stood as the judge left the bench, but the applause began anyway, quiet at first, then growing louder. The teenager looked slightly embarrassed by the attention, but he smiled politely, thanked those around him, and began to gather his notes. Outside, the reporters surrounded him again, microphones reaching from every direction. "How does it feel to win?" one asked. He paused before answering. "It's not about winning," he said simply. "It's about making sure the truth is heard. That's all that matters." His words were calm but powerful, echoing the same quiet strength he had shown throughout the trial. A young law student in the crowd called out, "You've inspired so many of us. What would you say to people who doubt themselves because of their age?" The teenager smiled gently. "Age doesn't decide how much you can learn," he replied. "Work hard, stay humble, and don't let anyone tell you that you're not ready if you know you are." The crowd cheered softly, and even the reporters lowered their cameras for a moment, just listening. As he walked away from the courthouse, the afternoon sun cast a warm light across the steps. He looked back once, seeing the crowd still talking, the reporters still speaking, and the grand doors of the courthouse slowly closing. A faint smile crossed his face. He knew that this wasn't just about one case, it was about something bigger. He had proven that knowledge, preparation, and honesty could break barriers no matter how young or underestimated someone might be. Later that evening, the judge sat at his desk reflecting on the day. He couldn't shake the feeling of pride he felt for the teenager, even though they weren't related in any way. He decided to write a letter, a rare gesture for him. In it, he expressed his respect and admiration. "You've reminded me," he wrote, "that the law is not only about experience, but about heart, courage, and truth." The teenager received the letter a few days later. He read it quietly, then placed it carefully inside a folder with his case notes. It wasn't the praise that mattered. It was the recognition that honesty and effort had spoken louder than appearance. Weeks passed, and the story continued to spread. Universities invited him to speak. Young people began following his journey online, calling him an inspiration. Even the judge mentioned him in later sessions, using his story as an example to young lawyers who appeared nervous or unsure. "If he could do it," the judge would say, "so can you." Despite the growing fame, the teenager never let it change him. He continued studying, helping with community cases, and mentoring others who needed guidance. His humility remained his greatest strength. He didn't chase awards or headlines. He cared only about helping people who couldn't stand up for themselves. One afternoon, months later, he returned to the same courthouse, not as a surprise or a curiosity, but as a respected young attorney. The security guards greeted him by name, and the clerk smiled as he walked by. The judge, now aware of his presence, welcomed him warmly. "It's good to see you again," he said. "You've become quite the example around here." The teenager smiled. "I'm just doing what I love," he replied. That day, he took another case representing someone who couldn't afford legal help. His passion hadn't faded. It had only grown stronger. When he stood in the courtroom again, facing another challenge, he carried with him all the lessons he had learned: the patience, the courage, the humility. And as he began to speak, those listening felt the same quiet power that had once silenced an entire courtroom. The story of the young attorney became something people told for years, a reminder that brilliance can appear in the most unexpected places, and that respect is earned not by age but by action.